Hey guys, it's Lauren here. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. Literally, I am back home. This is very nostalgic. Look, if you've been on my channel for a while, I think I did my first sit-down booktube video in this location, so this is pretty cool. This is pretty cool for me. I've honestly been looking forward to doing this since the beginning of the year, but I never thought I'd read enough books more to be able to do this because, again, I basically started reading again, like hardcore reading this year, but I ended up reading about 63 books and counting. Actually, maybe 64 because I literally just finished a book. But basically, I read way more than I expected. My reading goal was 20 books and I read 60, so that's like 3 times the amount that I expected. And since I read that much, I can make a cohesive list of this. So this video is going to be the worst books I read in 2020. We're gonna start off with the horribleness. We could get all of the terribleness of 2020. We're just gonna vent that out in this video. We're gonna talk about the books that I hated. Well, not necessarily hated, but just bad in some way. There are gonna be 3 categories: the confusing, ridiculous, and the books that were the most disappointing. It's gonna be a ride, but I'm honestly excited because I low-key love to just vent about my frustrations. I'm totally fine. I like to vent sometimes. So this is my opportunity to do so. We are going to start with the ridiculous because that's honestly seems like the most fun selection. I think I'm going to do that first. Number 1, the first ridiculous book that I'm going to talk about is Carry On, which is the first book of the Simon Snow series by Rainbow Rowell. And I am aware that this is a popular series. I'm aware, but I don't understand, y'all. I read Fangirl first, and that's a book I actually ended up loving by Rainbow Rowell, which is why I was surprised that I hated this one so much. This could have gone on my confusing list, but I decided to keep it in my ridiculous list because literally when I was reading it, I thought it was the most ridiculous thing ever. It's like Harry Potter fan fiction on crack. There's different levels of fan fiction, which is what some people don't understand. There's top tier fan fiction that you can clearly see reading as an actual book, as an actual novel, save for the fact that they aren't original characters. That's like the high level. And then there's the fan fiction that you can tell was written by like maybe an 8-year-old that doesn't have the best of an understanding of grammar, may or may not have been on a sugar high, may not have been written by the most articulate person. That's what Carry On read like to me. It was written like terrible fan fiction. The world building was terrible because we kind of just jumped straight into the book. Whoever his name, the Simon, the hero of the book, he was supposed to be in his 5th year or something, but he's supposed to be like later on in high school. So they're basically trying to explain the world as the story was commencing, but it didn't work. And just a lot of the system didn't work. And I think I actually did read the book in its completion, or at least I skipped to the end to read it and it still didn't make any sense to me. I think the appeal is the fact that it basically was supposed to be this, it was basically an actual series in the Fangirl universe, so that's also part of it. And the other part of it is the fact that it was a gay romance, which I was down for. I was ready to sit down and read a good romance novel, and it just was not. The magical world flopped. The characterization, like the actual characters themselves, flopped. None of them stood out in any way. The writing itself felt like it was written for, like Dork Diaries, like Diary of a Wimpy Kid. Except they know their audience, like they were aware of their audience, and honestly, they were probably written better than this book. So I didn't like it. I don't understand why y'all like it. I'm not gonna begrudge that though. Everyone likes what they like, but for me personally, it was written poorly. Anyway, moving on from roasting that book, the next ridiculous book that I read, The Apocalypse of Elena Mendoza by Sean David Hutchinson. How do I explain this book in words? Okay, so basically the premise of this book was the fact that there was an apocalypse coming, and I think the girl this character liked was shot at the Starbucks that she worked at, and she ended up saving her using this new healing power that she, discovered by saving her crush. So, because of that new power and the fact that there are so many witnesses, everyone's like wondering where her powers come from, things like that. And she ends up discovering from some ethereal being that her powers are a sign that the apocalypse is starting and that the world has a very short time limit left. Yeah, that's basically the premise of the book. I thought it sounded interesting. I am down for apocalypse books, and I thought this would be pretty good, especially since I heard that like another book that this author wrote was pretty good as well. I think it's called We Are the Ants, something like that. So I was like, okay, I can depend on this author to write a good book. Wrong. This book For one thing, the main character was so unlikable. And usually I don't mind that if like that's literally the premise of the book, the character is unlikable. I read Gone Girl for God's sakes, like I'm built for an unlikable protagonist. But it was so bad. Elena Mendoza, she sounded really whiny. She treated her friends like crap. I think there was like this real high school complex of caring about like whether or not popular people care about you. Maybe I've outgrown that side of YA where you like are so focused on cliques and like power dynamics in high school. Like this character seemed so focused on it that made me like more annoyed with her, and she wasn't good. Not only was the protagonist bad, but it was like it's an apocalypse piece of work, right? And it seemed to incorporate some like levels of Christianity into it, and I'm a Catholic, so I don't care if that's what I'm going and expecting, but then the entirety of the book ended up being some preachy end of the world. I don't even remember. It was really preachy though. Like it would say a lot of like things about like world lessons like in your face as opposed to like showing it through character and actual actions. It was really bad. I think I blocked that book out actually. I talked about it in a video and I think I permanently blocked it out of my mind because I barely remember. I just remember not liking the protagonist, the ending not making any sense. I think she ends up flying in the sky because the apocalypse happens. Her powers explode in some kind of way and I do not remember the rest. I don't mind books with a message because that's literally the entire purpose of a book, but it's like they were saying it like right in her face. It just to make the book seem even more irritating. It's like she didn't even learn anything. I don't think the protagonist actually learned anything. It was horrible. I do not recommend reading that at all. My last ridiculous book that I have on the list, The Lost Coast by A.R. Capetta. And this was a book about this girl who had to move from the East Coast, I believe, to the West Coast because of something that happened in her family. And when she moves to the West Coast, she ends up meeting this group of girls that seem very mystical, very mysterious. They are a group of witches. And eventually, because one of their members went missing, they needed a new witch in order to help find that missing member, and they ended up enlisting the protagonist, who didn't realize that she had witchy powers at all, but she ends up discovering like her abilities with this group of girls, and we kind of just do witchy things and go on that adventure in order to find the missing friend, who by the way isn't actually missing. It's more like her mind is gone, so like mentally she isn't present anymore. So basically looking for a soul throughout the book. See, hearing that premise, it sounds interesting, right? I was like, okay, I'm down for this. I can read this, I can enjoy this. Yeah, I didn't enjoy it. And it largely had to do with the fact that the book was trying way too hard to be whimsical. There's like TV shows like Euphoria, right? That intertwine the mysticism and kind of like the more ethereal aspects of the show into like the more grounded, heartbreaking parts of the show in order to like bring across some sort of message, right? This one was kind of just, you know, like how in the early 2010s we like to pretend, at least like in our like pre-teens or whatever, when we were like, when we were little shits, like the time period when we were probably the most shitty like version of ourselves. We used to think that, oh, if only I could find my group of friends that were just so mysterious and that were so cool, and I could be part of that group, and we could all pretend that we were like above the rest of these peasants, and then we could just go frolic in the woods and just explore our powers. That's what this book was trying to be. Yeah, this book was basically like the 2010s drama that incorporates supernatural in some way. It's like the worst aspects of all of the media I like to consume in the 2010s when I was like 13. Yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say about that. It tried so hard to be like to fit into this like whimsical aesthetic, like forest girls and like cottagecore. Yeah, that's perfect. That's actually the perfect word. It was trying to be cottagecore, like that aesthetic, except don't crack. Like all they basically did was frolic in the woods. I literally couldn't finish it because it was just so much of like the characters doing weird shit in the woods and just like not going to school even though they were high schoolers, and not even like to do adventures. It basically just to like do weird spells that didn't actually like have any cool action to it in the woods. If there was a way to sum up this book, it would be frolicking in the woods. And I mainly wanted to read it because I think I was trying to read this book during Pride Month, and I knew it had LGBTQ plus representation, and I was like, okay, I'm down for that. Like LGBTQ plus representation, witches, I love reading about witches, and a missing person. I was down for that. But it was just, it didn't meet my expectations at all. It was horrible. Now we're gonna move on to confusing books that ended up on my worst rated list. And we'll start off with the first thing on my confusing list for the worst books of 2020, and that would be The 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle by Stuart Turton. I feel bad because I was really looking forward to this book. I got it for my birthday, but I did not like it. I didn't like it at all, and I think it was because, for one, like, let me just say the premise. Basically, this protagonist named Aiden, he is trapped in this time loop, kind of like a Groundhog Day scenario, until he can figure out who killed Evelyn Hardcastle, which is one of the heirs to the house. It's one of those like gothic literature kind of things. He jumps bodies as he does it, which I thought was an interesting twist to the Groundhog Day scenario. And I was like, okay, I can be down for this. Like, how can I possibly go wrong here? Here's the thing that could go wrong. It was a mystery novel, a mystery murder novel, a whodunit kind of novel. And I didn't care about whodunit because there was no tension. There was no tension in the mystery novel. You can see how that can possibly ruin my experience. It's like, there were definitely a lot of things happening, but never once did I feel like anticipation over what was going to happen. Like, it's kind of just like things happened, but there's no like tension build up to whatever it was that occurred. The jumping bodies aspect of the book was really cool. It was really good. But the actual figuring out of the mystery, it wasn't heart racing enough. And I think part of that had to do with the fact that the protagonist, he didn't know who he was for most of the book. Like, he jumps bodies, but he has no idea like why he's in a time loop, how he ended up there. And yeah, it like messes with him because the personalities of the bodies that he like enters into try to take over him as he enters them. And that was a really cool aspect, but also made it hard for there to be stakes because the protagonist didn't know what he was fighting for exactly. Like, he didn't know why he had to escape other than not wanting to be brutally murdered by the same person that was trying to mess with Evelyn Hardcastle. And because of the lack of stakes, there was a lack of tension, and it's really upsetting because the story had so much potential, but it was basically like solving a puzzle when you're 5. You know, when you're 5, you don't really care about puzzles, but you kind of have to do it. And as you put in the pieces, you feel like a mild enjoyment of it. You're like, yay, I completed the puzzle. We don't necessarily feel excited. You know what I'm saying? That's basically how I felt. It was like a bland puzzle. Yeah, I hope that was a good description. It just fell short of everything I wanted, and it was really sad. The next book that I read that ended up on this list that was confusing was Where the Crawdads Sing by Delia Owens. And I'm also upset because this is another hyped up book of 2020. It was really hyped up around March, I believe, around the beginning of quarantine. And it was one of the books I was reading in order to get through quarantine. So I had high hopes because a lot of people recommended it. Even like Reese Witherspoon was like, she loved the book. And I thought, why not? It was out of my comfort zone actually, because the book is about a swamp girl who basically has been abandoned by her entire family at her family home in the middle of a swamp. And the swamp is her home. She didn't necessarily get an education. All that she learned was from the swamp that she was surrounded by, so she basically self-educated herself. It's kind of a coming of age story of her trying to, you know, figure out what her life is going to be like now that she's alone. And amidst that, there's like a love story. There's something that ends up happening with one of her brother's old friends, and there's also a murder mystery happening in the background. It didn't go well, and I think it was because I was aware it was a coming of age story, but I thought the murder aspect of the book would end up taking a larger seat in it, and it didn't. It was kind of just there in the background. Like, I didn't feel like a oh gasp moment because the murder was very detached from the rest of the story. So it kind of just felt like oh yeah, by the way, this character died, as opposed to leading up to like a more like scary conclusion to the book. It was way more whimsical than I expected, and not whimsical in the same sense as The Lost Coast where like there's magic and stuff like that, but it definitely focused a lot on nature descriptions because the character spent so much time by herself wandering around the swamp, so there was a lot of nature description in what she was doing. And I think just because I'm personally not that interested in those kind of things, and whenever a book goes into too deep a description, I just end up losing interest. So in that sense, it also fell flat for me as well. But again, I didn't really think it would be a book I'd typically pick up. I went to expand my reading horizons and try out something that I hadn't tried before, which was a book like this, and it failed. I think I also failed in the sense that like I expected her to find out something about her mother because her mother was also missing. That was another mystery part of this book. Her mother like disappeared a while ago because the protagonist's father beat her a lot. So like since the character thought back a lot to like what her mother used to say to her when she was like a child, I thought that the mother would end up coming back in her life in some like big way, but again, that was more flat toned in the book as well. Basically, it just felt flat. The entire story felt like really flat to me. Most of the love interest characters were trash, like I didn't root for either of them. The fact it was so nature focused kind of threw me off because I feel like it was more focusing on the beauty of the landscape of the book as opposed to like the beauty that potentially lay within the characters. So that was another thing. And then the murder part of the book, even though it was like seemed to be a big part of the synopsis, it didn't matter at all for the majority of the story. Like it didn't connect to the characters much at all until like maybe the last 50 pages. That was really disappointing. I didn't enjoy that, and yeah, it really did fall flat. The fact that I don't even feel passionate talking about it says a lot about how I felt about it, but you know, it's whatever. The next and last book, I believe that was in the confusing list of the worst books that I read in 2020 was The Power by Naomi Alderman. I was expecting to really like this book because it's a book, let me tell you the premise. It takes place like all over the world. It's multiple perspectives of people from all over the world. I forgot exactly what it was some natural phenomenon, but after the phenomenon happens, all the girls end up gaining super strength. And after they gain it, the world drastically begins to change because obviously since women end up being more powerful than men, the power dynamic changes in that kind of sense. So I was like, oh, this is really interesting. I think I want to read it. Basically because I'm a vindictive bitch, and I was ready to see men be whooped in the book. I don't know what I was expecting. I was like, you know, like those memes where it's like, if this happened and this is how society would look like, and it shows some utopia picture. That's what I thought this book would end up being like. Not necessarily a utopia. I think they would struggle a lot, but in a way, like they would somehow end up making the world better. This book was basically like a social commentary, and by the end of it, like this may be spoilers, so if you plan on reading it, maybe skip this part. But by the end of it, the women ended up making the world worse, which is surprising. The idea is that all the women end up becoming power hungry with their powers, and they try to take over countries, which I was like, all right, but I was down for it first. Then they end up like killing a ton of people and apparently them to making men slaves, and they treat them really, really horribly. I get that from perspective because I'd be frustrated with men in our society sometimes, but maybe it's just a prideful part of me, but I just didn't believe that women would somehow make the world worse or treat men like the same or in a worse way than they treated women. I just feel like we're better than that. I feel like we're better than that because we understand what that feels like. There are a lot of good aspects of the book and it had a lot of potential, but at the end of it, I think it ended up falling flat just because of the idea that women would end up doing the same thing as men and in fact end up doing like worse things than men, and that the world would somehow regress if women became more powerful. That's where the line was drawn for me. I thought we would make it better. That's like what I always thought. It's like when we're more powerful. Like if we suddenly gain powers now in 2020, for one, we fucking like would steal the presidency. Not what this book had in mind. That's not what the author had in mind. And I think just that concept of that, like that outlook, I just fundamentally disagreed with, so I didn't end up liking the book. That was disappointing because of that. It was a little confusing just because I didn't expect it to end the way that it did. Now, that was the final book for the confusing section. Now we move on to the first book is The Starless Sea by Erin Morgenstern. And this book really disappointed me because I enjoyed The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern, which I believe was her debut novel. It was really enjoyable because it was like a romance that took place in like this never-ending circus. We're not going to go into that though because I'm pretty sure a lot of people already know about it, but I would just say I would recommend it because I enjoyed it personally a lot. And people said the pacing of that book was slow, and I personally disagreed with that, but when I ended up reading The Starless Sea, I understood what they meant when they said the pacing of Erin Morgenstern books were slow because man, it felt so fucking slow. I'm not going to go too into it because I made a whole video talking about how much I didn't like the book. I'll link it down below for you guys to check it out if you want because I really did not like it. The pacing was really slow, but aside from that, there's basically no plot. The whole idea was that the author was kind of like incorporating this like world literary nerds would be obsessed with because it was this underground secret library that was enhanced by magic and storytelling and all this other stuff. It would be cool. It would be dreamland for people like me, except for the fact that the way the story was written was so, like, it was a book about plot. And obviously we can see the problem with that. That's all I'm going to say about that because I have a whole video explaining it and I really don't want to get into it again, but yeah, there was no plot. There was no plot. Now, the last book for this video, I'm Not Dying With You Tonight. I'm Not Dying With You Tonight was written by two authors, and one was a black author, one was a white author. They're both women, and it was a story of how this riot ends up happening at the school. Yeah, I think it takes place around the same time as the Rodney King riots. These two students, a black girl and a white girl, they end up being stuck together in that night at school because of the riots and they have to find their way home together. So that's basically what happens, and I thought it'd be interesting to read because it was around the time of the Black Lives Matter movement really increasing this year in June, and I just felt so much pent up anger. I went to read as many black voiced books as possible just because, first of all, I am black. that's something I wanted to do anyway, but for another I want to be able to talk about them a lot on my channel. So I thought this would be one of the good ones that I would end up recommending on my channel, but it fell short in so many ways. But I think I'm gonna focus on the main way it disappointed me, and it was the fact that the black girl ended up acting as the educator for the white girl, and I hated that. I hated that so much, because even though it can be a reality sometimes, it's just not feasible that this white girl would be so unaware of all of these like institutional problems. Like, no. How can someone possibly be that ignorant? And the white girl, actually, I think she wasn't originally from LA or where that school and where those riots took place. She's from somewhere else and she recently moved there, so she was like the new girl at school. But how ignorant she was, I'm like, how can someone possibly be this ignorant? But somehow the black girl had to educate her on everything. And I'm like, why does she have to act? Why is this girl that's the same age as like this white girl have to act as the fucking like educator for this white girl and like teach her about racism? Like, I hate that trope so much. I hate it so much because I just don't think, like, sure, we're a source, probably like a source of some sort of education, but I don't like the way that had to be put on the black girl's shoulders. Like, she had to teach her about that while they're in the middle of trying to escape a riot. I didn't like the fight with the white girl. She didn't seem to go through that much development. Both characters actually didn't seem to go through that much development. It just seemed to be like basically like the black girl explaining racism to the white girl as they go from location to location in the middle of the Rodney King riot. You know, it's not like anything like really big actually happens to them. It was very disappointing, and it actually probably made me angrier just reading it. We're finally done with roasting the books. Those were the worst books that I read in 2020. This wasn't meant to insult anyone. If you guys liked any of the books on this list, I mean, everyone has their own preference. Like, I'm not gonna judge you for that because I probably definitely liked some books that some people might raise their eyebrows at. But yeah, that was personally just what I didn't like. So I hope you guys enjoyed. Thank you guys for watching this video. If you liked this video, you should like, comment, and subscribe. Follow me on my medias because they are both linked down below. And I will see you guys in the next one. Bye-bye.